The bank said, "Your husband is here with a woman who looks just like you." And the silence that followed on the line felt heavier than the words themselves. Margaret Hale stood in her kitchen, one hand resting on the cool edge of the marble counter, the other gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Outside, late afternoon light slid through bare maple branches, casting long, thin shadows across the hardwood floor. The house was quiet in the way only long marriages know how to be quiet. No television, no radio, just the soft ticking of the clock she and Daniel had bought together almost 35 years ago, back when time felt generous. She did not answer right away, not because she did not understand, but because her mind refused to accept the shape of what it was being asked to hold. The voice on the phone waited, careful, professional, trained to pause when something fragile might break. Margaret drew in a breath through her nose, slow, controlled. "I'm sorry," she said. "Say that again." The banker cleared his throat. She could hear papers shifting, a pen tapping once, then stopping. "Mrs. Hale, this is Thomas Whitaker from North River Private Bank. Your husband, Daniel Hale, is at our Hartford branch. He's accompanied by a woman who is presenting herself as you. She resembles you closely enough that one of our junior associates initially believed she was speaking with you in person." Margaret closed her eyes. For a brief, shameful second, her first thought was that she must have misunderstood something, that perhaps Daniel had brought a cousin, a sister, anyone but the shape that sentence implied. She had spent a lifetime solving problems by assuming there was a reasonable explanation waiting just out of sight. "Thomas," she said, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. "I am in my home in Old Lyme. I have not authorized anyone to represent me at your bank today, and I am not with my husband." Another pause. Longer this time. When Thomas spoke again, the edge of strain had crept into his voice. "That is why I'm calling. Your accounts require verbal confirmation for any action above a certain threshold. Mr. Hale is requesting a review of several legacy trusts. He claims it is part of a broader estate planning update." Estate planning. The words landed with a dull weight. Margaret opened her eyes and stared at the window over the sink. Her reflection looked older than she felt. 62, yes, but still upright, still sharp, still very much herself. "Are any transactions being processed right now?" she asked. "No," Thomas said quickly. "Not without your confirmation, but I felt it was important to alert you immediately." Margaret nodded even though he could not see her. Her mind began to move, clicking into a rhythm she had not used in years. Before retirement, before she stepped back from the firm, this was how she survived rooms full of men who underestimated her because she spoke softly and listened longer than they expected. "Do not tell them you've contacted me," she said. "Tell them compliance needs additional documentation. Buy time. How long can you stall?" 30 minutes, Thomas said. "Possibly more." "Make it an hour," Margaret said. "I'll be there." The call ended. The house seemed to inhale around her. She did not cry, not yet. Instead, she reached for her coat, then stopped. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the counter until they steadied. The refrigerator hummed. The clock kept ticking. Somewhere in the house, her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel that she did not read. On the drive north, traffic thickened near the river. Margaret let the car crawl. Rushing would not help. Panic would only dull her edges. She needed clarity. She needed proof. And beneath that, coiled tight in her chest, was a question she had avoided for years. When had Daniel started thinking she was no longer paying attention? At a red light, she called Ellen Price, a woman whose number she rarely dialed but had never deleted. Ellen answered on the second ring. "Margaret, I need you," Margaret said. "Not as a friend, as a lawyer." A pause. Then Ellen's voice sharpened. "Where are you?" "On my way to North Riverbank in Hartford." Another pause, shorter this time. "Stay in your car when you arrive. Do not confront anyone alone. I'll meet you there." Margaret hung up and turned onto the highway. The sky darkened, clouds pulling low and heavy, the kind that promised snow later. She remembered a younger version of herself, sitting in a conference room decades earlier, listening as someone explained why her name would not be on the door. She remembered how she learned to build power quietly, piece by piece, until it belonged to her whether anyone acknowledged it or not. North River Bank rose out of the street like an old promise. Limestone facade, brass handles polished by generations of hands. Inside, the air smelled faintly of leather and paper. Margaret paused just outside the glass doors, watching her reflection merge with the interior beyond. She straightened her shoulders and stepped in. The lobby was calm. Too calm. Conversations carried in low tones. A man laughed softly near the investment desk. Somewhere, a printer hummed. Margaret walked past familiar faces who nodded at her without alarm. She did not go to the main floor. Instead, she turned down the side corridor that led to private client rooms. Voices drifted from behind a closed door. Daniel's voice, warm and practiced, the one he used when he wanted to sound reasonable. Another voice, lighter, careful. A woman's voice. Margaret tarred just short of the door. Her heart beat once, hard. She imagined pushing it open and finding a stranger wearing her face. She imagined the betrayal in physical form. The thought did not break her. It sharpened her. Ellen arrived moments later, her heels clicking once, then stopping beside Margaret. Their eyes met. Ellen read everything she needed to know in that look. She reached out and touched Margaret's arm. Grounding. Steady. Ready? Ellen asked. Margaret nodded. Inside, the room was arranged like a stage. Daniel sat with his back half-turned, one hand resting on the table as if he belonged there. Across from him sat the woman. She wore a navy coat Margaret owned in another color. Her hair was styled similarly, close enough to confuse someone who did not know what to look for. When Margaret stepped in, the room seemed to tilt. Daniel turned first. His smile froze. The woman's eyes widened. The banker rose halfway from his chair, caught between surprise and relief. "Margaret," Daniel said, "I can explain." Margaret did not look at him. She looked at the woman, took in the slight differences, the borrowed confidence, the tension in her jaw. "What's your name?" Margaret asked. The woman swallowed. Her gaze flicked to Daniel, then back. "Laura," she said, too quickly. Margaret smiled. It was not a kind smile. "That's interesting," she said softly, "because my name is Margaret Hale. And you are sitting in a room built for people who tell the truth." Ellen stepped forward, her voice calm and precise. "This meeting is over. Any further discussion will happen with counsel present." The banker nodded, already reaching for his phone. Daniel opened his mouth again, desperation creeping in around the edges. "You're overreacting. This was just paperwork, just a formality." Margaret finally looked at him. Really looked. She saw not just fear, but calculation. And something else. Relief, maybe, as if part of him was glad the quiet game was ending. She leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. Her voice dropped, controlled and cold. "You thought I wouldn't notice," she said. "You thought I had stepped back far enough to be replaced." Daniel said nothing. Margaret straightened. The room held its breath. Somewhere beyond the walls, the bank continued its quiet business. Inside, something larger was unfolding. Not just a marriage cracking open, but a reckoning that would reach far beyond this room. And Margaret Hale, the woman so many had quietly underestimated, felt something ancient and powerful rise within her. Not anger, resolve. Margaret did not raise her voice, and that unsettled everyone in the room far more than shouting ever could. She remained standing, hands relaxed at her sides, eyes fixed on Daniel with a stillness that felt deliberate, almost surgical. The banker cleared his throat again, the sound sharp in the quiet, and reached for a tablet on the table. Ellen had already positioned herself slightly between Margaret and Daniel, not protectively but strategically, like someone marking territory without announcing it. "Daniel," Margaret said at last, her tone even, "I want you to listen carefully before you say another word. Every sentence from this moment forward matters." She turned her head slightly toward the banker. "Thomas, I want a full pause on all activity linked to any trust, account, or instrument bearing my name, effective immediately." Thomas nodded, relief flashing across his face. "Already done, Mrs. Hale. Nothing moves without your signature and a secondary confirmation." "Good," Margaret said. Then she looked back at Daniel. "Now you can speak." Daniel exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for hours. "This is being blown out of proportion," he said. "Laura was just helping me sort documents. You know how complicated these things get. I didn't want to burden you." Margaret's eyes flicked briefly to the woman calling herself Laura. Laura's hands were folded too tightly in her lap. Her knee bounced once, then stilled when Margaret noticed. Margaret turned fully toward her. "You don't look like someone helping with documents," she said quietly. "You look like someone waiting for permission to leave." Laura's mouth opened, closed. Her gaze dropped to the floor. Ellen stepped in smoothly. "Daniel, you are no longer speaking directly to my client. If you have explanations, you can offer them later through counsel." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You hired a lawyer already?" Margaret answered before Ellen could. "I didn't hire her," she said. "She's been on retainer for over 20 years. I just didn't need her until now." That landed. Daniel's shoulders sagged a fraction. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. "Thomas," Margaret said, "I'd like copies of everything presented today. Identification, signatures, timestamps. I want to know exactly how close this came to becoming something irreversible." Thomas nodded again, fingers already moving. "Security has been alerted as well," he added carefully. "Standard procedure." Daniel looked up sharply. "Security? That's unnecessary." Margaret tilted her head. "You came here with a woman who looks enough like me to confuse trained professionals," she said. "Nothing about this is standard." The door opened quietly, and a uniformed security officer appeared, posture polite but unmistakably alert. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence alone shifted the balance in the room. Laura stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. "I didn't know it would be like this," she said, her voice thin. "I was told this was all cleared, that you were unavailable, that this was just helping your husband." Margaret studied her, not with anger, with assessment. "Who told you that?" Laura hesitated. Daniel turned toward her, his expression warning, almost pleading. Ellen noticed. Margaret noticed too. "Answer her," Ellen said. Laura swallowed. "A man named Victor," she said. "He said he worked with Daniel on retirement planning. He said I was a contingency, a backup." "A backup for what?" Margaret asked. Laura's eyes flicked to the security officer, then back to Margaret. "For appearances." Silence settled, thick and revealing. Margaret felt something cold slide into place inside her. This was not improvisation. This was rehearsal. "Victor," Margaret repeated. She turned to Daniel. "You brought someone else into our finances." Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. "You don't understand," he said. "I was trying to protect us, to protect myself." Margaret let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but not quite. "From what?" Daniel dropped his hands. His eyes were wet now, but his voice held an edge she recognized. "Resentment. From disappearing," he said. "From becoming an accessory to your life instead of a partner." Margaret absorbed that without flinching. "You disappeared years ago," she said. "You just blame me for not following." Ellen cleared her throat softly. "This conversation is no longer productive," she said. "Daniel, I advise you to leave the premises immediately." Daniel looked around the room as if searching for an ally. He found none. Even Thomas had turned his chair slightly away. The security officer stepped closer to the door, subtle but unmistakable. "Laura," Margaret said, her voice calm again, "you should leave as well. But before you do, you're going to give my attorney every detail you have about this Victor. Names, numbers, meetings, everything." Laura nodded quickly. "I will, I swear." She gathered her coat with shaking hands and left the room without looking back. Daniel stood more slowly. He paused beside Margaret. "I never thought you'd turn on me like this," he said quietly. Margaret met his gaze. I didn't turn on you, she replied. You walked away. I just stopped pretending not to notice. Daniel left. The door closed behind him with a soft, final click. For a moment, no one spoke. The banker busied himself with paperwork he had already finished. The security officer stepped back into the hallway. Ellen watched Margaret carefully. Only when they were alone did Margaret's shoulders drop. Just slightly. Enough to reveal the weight she had been carrying. Do you want to sit? Ellen asked. Margaret shook her head. If I sit, I might not get back up. Ellen nodded. Fair. Margaret walked to the window. Hartford stretched out below, gray and orderly, the river cutting through it like a quiet witness. She thought of the house she and Daniel had built together, the dinners, the routines, the compromises she had mistaken for peace. This wasn't about money, she said suddenly. Ellen joined her at the window. No, she agreed. It rarely is. Margaret folded her arms. Victor, she said again. That name doesn't come from nowhere. Ellen's expression hardened. No. And neither does a woman willing to impersonate you. Margaret turned. Her eyes were clear now, focused. I want to know how long this has been happening, she said. Who else is involved, and how far they were willing to go. Ellen nodded once. Then we proceed carefully. We document everything, and we don't assume this ends today. Margaret's phone vibrated in her pocket. She looked at the screen. An unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Mrs. Hale, a man's voice said, smooth, controlled. I believe we have a misunderstanding. Margaret felt a chill. She did not ask who he was. She already knew. I don't think so, she said. There was a pause, then a soft chuckle. We should talk, the man said. There are things about your husband you may not yet understand. Margaret looked at Ellen, who had gone very still. You'll speak to my attorney, Margaret said, or you won't speak to me at all. The line went dead. Margaret lowered the phone slowly. The city outside seemed to darken as clouds rolled in, heavy and inevitable. Ellen watched her, searching her face for cracks. Instead, she found resolve. This just got bigger, Ellen said. Margaret nodded. Good, she replied, because I'm done playing small. Somewhere beyond the bank walls, forces were already moving, deals unraveling, lies shifting shape. And Margaret Hale, the woman so many had assumed was finished, felt something else settle into her bones. Control. And she had no intention of letting it go. The call replayed in Margaret's mind long after the line went dead. The man's voice smooth enough to sound reasonable, dangerous enough to leave a residue on the air. She did not move right away. She stood by the window, watching clouds gather over the river, watching the reflection of her own face in the glass. Ellen was speaking, low and steady, already outlining next steps, but Margaret only half listened. Her attention had turned inward, to the quiet inventory she had learned to take whenever the ground shifted beneath her feet. What do I know? What do I not know? Who benefits from my confusion? Margaret, Ellen said again, more firmly this time. Margaret turned. I heard him before, she said. Not his voice, his confidence. Ellen narrowed her eyes. You've met him? No, Margaret said. I've felt him. Years ago, board dinners, charity galas, men who never introduce themselves directly, who speak through other people, who collect favors instead of signatures. Ellen nodded slowly. Then this wasn't a one-off. Daniel didn't wake up one morning and decide to become reckless. Margaret's mouth tightened. Daniel has always been reckless, she said. He just hid it behind charm. They left the bank together without speaking to anyone else. Outside, the air had turned sharp, wind cutting through coats and carrying the smell of rain. Margaret tarred at the steps, her hand hovering over the railing, as if grounding herself in something solid before continuing. I want eyes on Daniel, she said. Ellen did not hesitate. I know someone, former state investigator, quiet, expensive. Good, Margaret said. I want quiet. On the drive back toward Old Lyme, Margaret let the radio play softly, not for distraction but for company. The announcer's voice filled the car with ordinary concerns. Traffic, weather, a fundraiser downtown. The world kept turning, oblivious to the fracture running through her life. At home, the house greeted her with the same silence as before, but it felt altered now, like a familiar room after furniture has been moved. She set her keys down carefully, noticing the absence of Daniel's jacket on the hook by the door. A small detail, a confirmation. She went upstairs to the study. The room smelled faintly of old books and lemon polish. She opened the desk drawer where she kept things she no longer needed daily, but could not bring herself to discard. Old business cards, a faded photograph from her first office, a slim leather folder. Inside the folder were documents Daniel had never seen, not because she hid them, but because he had never asked the right questions. Trust agreements, corporate structures, the quiet scaffolding that held her life together long after she stepped away from the spotlight. Her phone rang again. This time the number was familiar. "I found him," Ellen said without preamble. "The man Laura mentioned, Victor Sloan." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "Tell me." "Financial consultant on paper," Ellen continued. "In reality, a fixer. He operates in retirement circles, estate planning seminars, private clubs, targets men who feel sidelined, teaches them how to reassert control without getting their hands dirty." Margaret felt a flicker of something like pity, quickly extinguished. "How long has Daniel known him?" "At least 2 years," Ellen said. "Longer than we thought." Margaret pictured those years now. The dinners Daniel insisted on attending alone, the sudden interest in legacy, the questions framed as concern. "Victor called me," Margaret said. Ellen went quiet. "What did he say?" "That we had a misunderstanding," Margaret replied, "which means he thinks he still has leverage." "And does he?" Margaret looked around the study, at the walls lined with books she had chosen, the desk she had paid for with her own money decades earlier. Not the kind he's used to. There was a knock at the door downstairs, sharp, unexpected. Margaret stiffened. "Are you expecting anyone?" Ellen asked. "No." Margaret moved to the top of the stairs, listening. Another knock, firmer now. She descended slowly, each step deliberate. When she opened the door, Daniel stood there, hair windblown, eyes rimmed red, hands empty. "I just want to talk," he said. Margaret did not step aside. "You lost that right today." Daniel swallowed. "He told me you'd react like this." Margaret's gaze sharpened. "He." Daniel nodded once. "Victor." Margaret felt the last piece slide into place. "He told you to come here." Daniel looked down. "He said you'd calm down, that you always do." Margaret leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. "And did he tell you what happens next?" Daniel shook his head. "Good," Margaret said softly, "because neither do you." She stepped back and closed the door, locking it with a click that sounded louder than it was. On the other side, Daniel remained silent. After a moment, his footsteps retreated. Margaret stood there longer than necessary, her palm resting against the wood. She felt no triumph, only clarity. Upstairs, she called Ellen back. "I want to accelerate," she said. "That means exposure," Ellen warned. Margaret's voice was steady. "It means sunlight." That evening, as darkness settled over the house, Margaret sat alone at the kitchen table, a single lamp casting a circle of light. She reviewed names, dates, patterns. She began to see the shape of it, larger than Daniel, larger than Victor. A system that fed on quiet compliance, on people who believed discretion was safety. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. A photograph loaded slowly. Daniel, seated across from a man Margaret recognized instantly from memory alone. Silver hair, relaxed posture, a hand resting casually on Daniel's shoulder. Victor Sloan. Below the image, a single line of text appeared. "You should have stayed retired." Margaret stared at the screen. The words did not frighten her. They clarified intent. She typed a response, short, precise. "You should have chosen a different family." She set the phone down and rose from the table. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling branches against the windows. Somewhere, someone believed she was outmatched, outmaneuvered, already obsolete. They had mistaken quiet for weakness. Margaret turned off the light and stood in the dark, feeling the old instincts return, sharper than ever. She was no longer reacting, she was positioning, and the game they had dragged her into was one she knew how to win. By morning, the story had already begun to move without her. Margaret woke before dawn, not from fear, but from the quiet certainty that something irreversible had shifted overnight. The house was still dark, the kind of darkness that made familiar rooms feel slightly foreign. She lay still for a moment, listening to the sound of her own breathing, steady and controlled, then swung her legs over the side of the bed. In the bathroom mirror, she studied her face. No tears, no panic, just a thin line of resolve settling deeper into her features. She dressed carefully, choosing clothes that felt neutral, almost invisible. Power, she had learned long ago, did not need to announce itself. Downstairs, the kettle whistled softly. As she poured the water, her phone vibrated on the counter. Ellen. "They're moving faster than I expected," Ellen said. "Daniel filed a preliminary petition last night, emergency access request. He's claiming you're mentally overwhelmed and that the estate requires temporary joint control." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Of course he did. "It won't hold," Ellen continued, "not without evidence, but it tells me Victor is pushing him." Margaret carried her mug to the window. Outside, frost clung to the lawn, silvering the grass. "Victor doesn't push," she said. "He guides. He makes people believe the idea was theirs." Ellen paused. "There's more." Margaret waited. "The investigator I mentioned," Ellen said. "His name is Paul Henson. He ran background quietly overnight. Victor Sloan isn't just a consultant. He's been adjacent to 4 civil disputes in the last decade. 2 involved trusts. 1 involved a conservatorship attempt. All were settled. Quietly. Margaret felt something cold and steady lock into place. "Patterns," she said. "Yes," Ellen replied. "And in every case, the initial move looked domestic. Family conflict. Concern for capacity. It only became criminal when someone pushed back." Margaret's grip tightened around the mug. Steam curled upward, then vanished. "Victor escalates when challenged." "That's our assumption," Ellen said, "which means you need to be careful." Margaret smiled faintly. "Careful isn't the same as passive." After the call, she drove not to the office she no longer officially occupied, but to the building across the street. The one people forgot was hers. The lobby guard looked up, surprised, then nodded respectfully. "Morning, Mrs. Hale." "Good morning," Margaret replied. "I need access to conference room C." He hesitated. "That room's been empty for months." "Perfect," she said. Inside, the room smelled of dust and old coffee. Marg set her bag down and opened the folder she had carried from home. Inside were names most people would not recognize. Trustees, board members, account managers. People who owed her favors, not because she demanded them, but because she remembered who they were when no one else did. She began making calls. Not urgent ones, not panicked ones. Calm, measured conversations framed as routine check-ins. Each call planted a seed, a question, a quiet concern. By the time she finished, the room felt warmer, charged with invisible connections tightening across distance. Her phone buzzed again. A new number. She let it ring twice before answering. "Mrs. Hale," Victor's voice said smoothly, "I was hoping we might speak again." Margaret leaned back in the chair. "You're persistent." "Only when I sense potential," Victor replied, "and you have quite a bit of it." "You threaten me," Margaret said flatly. Victor chuckled softly. "I warned you." "You sent me a photograph," she corrected. "That's intimidation." "That depends on how you interpret it," Victor said. "Daniel is fragile right now. Men at his age often are when they feel cornered. I'd hate for this to become something uglier than it needs to be." Margaret's voice remained steady. "You should be very careful about what you imply." Victor paused, just a beat, long enough to signal calculation. "I think you and I could reach an understanding," he said. "A clean separation, assets preserved, reputations intact." "Whose reputation?" Margaret asked. Another pause. Then a soft laugh. Yours, of course. Margaret felt no anger, only clarity. You don't know me, she said. I know enough, Victor replied. You stepped back. You let Daniel take the spotlight. You chose quiet. I chose discretion, Margaret said. There's a difference. Victor sighed almost theatrically. Discretion works until it doesn't. And intimidation works, Margaret said, until it meets resistance. The line went dead. Margaret set the phone down slowly. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened screen. She was not shaking, not even slightly. Later that afternoon, Daniel's daughter from his first marriage called. Emily's voice was strained, careful. He showed up at my place last night, she said. He was not himself. Margaret closed her eyes. What did he say? He kept talking about losing everything, Emily replied. About how you were shutting him out. He asked if I'd testify that you've been unstable lately. Margaret inhaled slowly. And what did you tell him? Emily hesitated. I told him I wasn't going to lie for him. Margaret felt a flicker of gratitude. Thank you. I'm sorry, Emily said softly. I didn't see this coming. Neither did I, Margaret replied, but I see it now. That evening, the investigator called. Paul Henson's voice was low, direct. Victor Sloan is sloppy when he thinks he's winning, he said. He's already reached out to 2 secondary contacts connected to your accounts. Phishing. Testing. Marga sat at her desk, the lamplight casting sharp shadows. Good, she said. Paul paused. Most people don't react like that. I'm not most people, Margaret replied. She ended the call and opened her laptop. Not to browse, not to distract herself. She logged into systems she had not touched in years. Layers of access unfolded smoothly, like doors recognizing her touch. She had built these structures. Others had merely occupied them. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the windows. Margaret did not look up. Her fingers moved with quiet certainty across the keys, setting in motion processes designed not for speed, but for inevitability. Victor thought in terms of pressure. She thought in terms of exposure. By the time the house lights dimmed automatically for the night, Margaret had already begun to reverse the balance of power. Quietly, methodically, without spectacle. Somewhere across town, Victor Sloan believed he was tightening the net. He did not yet realize that Margaret Hale had stopped struggling against it. She was mapping it. And once she finished, there would be nowhere left for him to hide. By the 5th day, Victor Sloan stopped calling. That silence was not relief. It was confirmation. Margaret noticed it the way she noticed changes in weather pressure, the way sailors learned to feel storms before the sky darkened. Victor did not retreat. He repositioned. Men like him always did. When pressure failed, they sought angles. When angles closed, they looked for leverage buried in history. That morning, Margaret sat at the long dining table with folders spread before her, legal documents interlaced with handwritten notes. Paul Henson's investigation had grown teeth overnight. Names repeated, addresses overlapped, shell entities threaded through trusts like fine wire. Victor was not a lone operator, he was a node. The house phone rang. Not her cell, the landline. Margaret stared at it for a moment before lifting the receiver. Mrs. Hale, a woman's voice said. Professional. Tired. This is Judge Rebecca Collins' chambers. She's requesting a brief call regarding a petition filed late last night. Margaret closed her eyes slowly. There it was. Of course, she said. I'm available. Minutes later, the judge's voice came through, measured but concerned. Margaret, I want to be very clear. I'm not ruling on anything yet. But your husband's counsel is requesting a temporary conservatorship evaluation. They're alleging cognitive decline. Margaret felt no shock, only a cold, precise anger. Based on what evidence? She asked. That's exactly my question, the judge replied. But the request alone triggers certain procedures. I wanted you to hear it directly from me. Margaret straightened in her chair. Thank you for the courtesy. After the call ended, Margaret remained still. The accusation hung in the air, heavier than any financial threat. Money could be traced. Lies could be exposed. But sanity, once questioned publicly, left a residue no ruling could fully erase. Victor had escalated. She dialed Ellen immediately. "They're going for capacity," Margaret said. Ellen exhaled sharply. "I was afraid of that." "Good," Margaret replied. "Then we're prepared." They met that afternoon in Conference Room C again, the forgotten room that had become a command center. Ellen laid out the counterstrike with surgical clarity. Medical records, independent evaluations, witness affidavits, Margaret's calendar from the past year, lectures given, boards attended, decisions signed. "They're counting on your age," Ellen said, "on the stereotype, quiet woman, retired, easy to reframe." Margaret nodded. "They always do." That evening, Daniel called again. This time, Margaret answered. "I didn't want it to be like this," he said immediately, voice raw. "Victor said it was a formality, just temporary. He said you'd understand." Margaret leaned against the counter, watching dusk settle outside the window. "Did he also tell you what happens after they decide I'm unfit?" Daniel was silent. "They appoint someone," Margaret continued, "usually the spouse. They freeze my access. They review my decisions retroactively. They dismantle everything I built and call it protection." Daniel swallowed. "I was scared." "So was I," Margaret said. "The difference is I didn't betray anyone to soothe it." He began to cry then, real tears this time. He said I was invisible, that I deserved more. Margaret closed her eyes. "And you believed him because part of you already felt that way." "Yes. That's the part you need to sit with," she said quietly. "Not me." She ended the call before he could speak again. The next morning, Margaret walked into a medical office she had helped fund years earlier, long before retirement. The neurologist greeted her warmly, not as a patient, but as a colleague of sorts. Tests were administered. Memory, logic, pattern recognition, decision-making under pressure. Margaret completed them without effort. The neurologist looked at her results, then at her face. "Who's questioning your capacity?" he asked. Margaret smiled thinly. "Someone who benefits from the doubt." By noon, affidavits were being drafted. By evening, Victor's legal team received notice that any attempt to pursue conservatorship would be met with countersuits alleging abuse of process and elder exploitation. Paul called late that night. "Victor's angry," he said. "He didn't expect you to move this fast." Margaret sat in the dark, one lamp glowing beside her. "He underestimated time," she said. "Men like him think experience erodes sharpness. It doesn't. It removes noise." Paul hesitated. "There's something else. I traced one of Victor's shell entities. It funded a nonprofit. Senior advocacy. Sounds harmless. It's how he builds credibility before he strikes." Margaret's jaw tightened. "He hides behind protection language." "Yes," Paul said, "and it gives him cover." Margaret stood and walked to the window. The street was quiet. Neighbors' lights flickered on and off. Normal life continuing, unaware of the machinery grinding beneath it. "Then we don't just expose him," she said. "We dismantle the language he hides behind." The next week unfolded like controlled detonation. Margaret testified calmly before the judge. Her voice never wavered. Ellen presented evidence with restraint, letting facts do the damage. The conservatorship petition was dismissed within minutes, the judge's tone sharp as she addressed Daniel's counsel. Outside the courtroom, Victor's attorney avoided Margaret's gaze. That afternoon, Margaret held a meeting in a place Victor could not access. A private foundation boardroom. Long table, familiar faces. People who had watched her step back and assumed she was done. She corrected them without raising her voice. Victor Sloan's name surfaced quietly in conversations that mattered. Banks flagged accounts. Boards questioned affiliations. Invitations stopped arriving. Doors did not slam. They simply closed. Late one night, Margaret received one final message from Victor. "You could have let this end quietly." Margaret read it once, then deleted it. Quiet had never been the same as safe. She stood alone in her kitchen, the clock ticking steadily, the house no longer silent but alive with intent. Somewhere, Victor Sloan was realizing that the woman he thought he could erase had not just resisted him. She had turned the light on. And men like Victor did not survive illumination. They dissolved under it. The first subpoena arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered, heavy paper inside a plain envelope that carried no drama in its appearance and all of it in its meaning. Margaret signed for it herself. The courier offered a polite smile, unaware that he was passing along the beginning of the end for several carefully constructed lies. She closed the door, rested the envelope on the hall table, and stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Not from fear, from recognition. This was the phase Victor could not control. Courts did not negotiate. Paper did not flinch. She opened the envelope slowly. Requests for records, communications, financial disclosures tied to entities that, on the surface, had nothing to do with her marriage. On the second page, she saw it clearly. Victor's architecture. The way he layered distance between himself and consequence. Ellen arrived an hour later, coat still dusted with cold air, expression sharp. "He's trying to pull everything into civil territory," she said, scanning the pages. "Delay, exhaustion. He wants to bury us in procedure." Margaret poured 2 cups of coffee and slid one across the table. "Then we don't chase him there." Ellen looked up. "Meaning?" "Meaning we shift the lens," Margaret said. "This isn't about a marriage anymore, it's about pattern." They worked through the afternoon, documents spread across the dining table, daylight fading unnoticed. Ellen mapped legal routes. Margaret filled in gaps with memory. Names of men Daniel once mentioned casually. Luncheons, conferences, comments that had felt off at the time but harmless enough to dismiss. At one point, Ellen stopped and looked at her. "You've been collecting this longer than you realized." Margaret nodded. "I just didn't know what it was for yet." That night, Paul called with urgency in his voice. "Victor's moving money," he said. "Not fast, not sloppy, but enough to signal preparation." "Where?" Margaret asked. "Trust to trust," Paul replied. "Non-profits, advisory fees, speaking honorariums. He's laundering legitimacy." Margaret stared at the dark window. Her reflection looked older in the glass, but harder, too. "He's trying to outrun consequence." "Yes," Paul said, "and he thinks time is on his side." Margaret smiled faintly. "It isn't." The next day, Margaret attended a luncheon she had not planned to go to. A senior financial forum hosted at a private club Victor frequented. She arrived quietly, dressed plainly, took a seat near the back. No announcement, no entrance worth noting. Victor was there. He stood at the front of the room speaking smoothly about legacy planning, about dignity in later life, about protecting families from conflict. Margaret watched the audience nod along. Gray heads, folded hands. Trust earned by familiarity, not scrutiny. She did not interrupt. She listened. When the floor opened for questions, Margaret raised her hand. Victor's eyes found her instantly. His smile flickered, then returned, polished and practiced. "Yes," he said, "the lady in the back." Margaret stood. The room turned slightly, curious but relaxed. "You spoke about protection," she said calmly. "Can you explain how many times your advisory strategies have resulted in court intervention?" The air shifted. Victor chuckled lightly. "That's a complex question," he said. "Any advisory work carries risk." "Of course," Margaret replied. "Then perhaps a simpler one. How many of your clients have had conservatorship petitions filed within 12 months of engaging your services?" A murmur rippled through the room. Victor's smile tightened. "I don't track outcomes in that way." "But courts do," Margaret said. "And so do banks." Silence fell heavier now. Someone shifted in their seat. Victor met her gaze, something sharp flashing behind his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, "this forum isn't the place for personal grievances." Margaret nodded. "You're right," she said. "Courts are." She sat down. Victor finished his talk quickly after that. The applause was polite. restrained. By evening, Ellen had already received 3 calls, one from a bank compliance officer, one from a foundation board member, one from a man who had quietly withdrawn his name from Victor's advisory list. "He's bleeding credibility," Ellen said, slowly, exactly where it hurts. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Good. But Victor was not finished. 2 days later, a reporter called. Not a tabloid, a respected financial journal, the kind that did not publish lightly. The questions were careful, informed, dangerous. Margaret answered only one. "Yes," she said. "I believe there is a coordinated effort targeting older women with significant assets through emotional manipulation and legal intimidation." The article ran the following morning. No accusations, just patterns. Quotes from unnamed sources. Court filings referenced but not sensationalized. Victor's name appeared once. That was enough. By the end of the week, Daniel's attorney requested a settlement conference. Not about divorce, about damage control. Margaret declined. That evening, she received a voicemail from Victor. No charm left now, just tight restraint. "You're crossing lines you don't understand," he said. "This can still end quietly." Margaret deleted it without replying. She stood in her study afterward, surrounded by the quiet order of a life she had built deliberately. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and relentless, covering the ground without resistance. Ellen called one last time before bed. "Federal interest," she said simply. "They're asking questions Victor can't redirect." Margaret sat down slowly, not from weakness, from gravity. "Thank you," she said. After the call, she remained seated, hands resting in her lap, breathing evenly. She thought of all the women she had seen shrink to preserve peace, all the men who mistook silence for surrender. Victor Sloan had built his power in the shadows between people's assumptions. Margaret Hale had spent her life learning how systems worked from the inside, and now the machinery was turning. Not fast, not loud, but inexorably. The knock came just after sunrise, firm and deliberate, the kind that carried authority without needing to announce itself. Marg was already awake. She had learned over the past weeks to sleep lightly, not from fear, but from anticipation. When she opened the door, 2 federal agents stood on the porch, dark coats against the pale morning, badges visible but not thrust forward. Respectful, controlled, serious. "Mrs. Hale," the taller one said, "I'm Agent Samuel Ortiz. This is Agent Karen Liu. We'd like a few minutes of your time." Margaret stepped aside without hesitation. Of course. They sat at the dining table where contracts had once been signed, where holiday dinners had stretched late into the night. Now the table held nothing but a legal pad and a pen. Margaret noticed the way Agent Liu's eyes moved, cataloging exits, windows, details. Professionals, not predators. "We're not here because of your husband," Ortiz said once they were seated. "At least not only because of him." Margaret nodded. "You're here because of Victor Sloan." Ortiz's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You've done your homework." "I've done my living," Margaret replied. Agent Liu leaned forward. "We've been tracking Mr. Sloan for some time. Elder financial exploitation, abuse of conservatorship law, coordinated manipulation using proxies. Until now, every case collapsed before it reached indictment." Margaret folded her hands. "Because his victims were isolated." "Yes," Liu said. "And because he never appeared directly in the paperwork." Margaret's voice was calm. "Until now." Ortiz exchanged a glance with Liu. "Until you." They laid out what they had. Wire transfers masked as consulting fees. Testimony from a former associate who had taken a plea deal quietly in another state. Court filings that, when placed side by side, revealed a pattern too consistent to ignore. And at the center of it all, Victor Sloan's name, appearing just often enough to matter, never enough to implicate him outright. "We need someone willing to testify," Ortiz said. "Not just about what happened to them, but about how he operates, his language, his pressure points, the way he builds trust before he breaks it." Margaret did not answer immediately. She rose and walked to the window, looking out at the frost-coated yard. Somewhere in the distance, a car passed, tires crunching softly. Ordinary life, uninterrupted. "You're asking me to become visible," she said finally. "Yes," Lou replied, "and we don't ask that lightly." Margaret turned back to them. "Then let me be clear. I won't do this quietly. I won't be a sealed affidavit or an unnamed source. If I step forward, it's with my name, my face, and my full cooperation." Ortiz's expression shifted, respect replacing caution. "That changes things." "It should," Margaret said, "because he survives on the assumption that women like me would rather preserve dignity than pursue truth." They left an hour later with copies of documents and a promise to return. Margaret closed the door behind them and rested her forehead briefly against the wood. The house felt different now. Not threatened, activated. Her phone rang before she could move away. "Ellen." "They're here, aren't they?" Ellen said. "Yes," Ellen exhaled. "That fast." "He pushed too hard," Margaret replied. "He always does." The deposition was scheduled for the following week. Margaret prepared the way she had always prepared for difficult rooms. She reviewed timelines, replayed conversations, examined her own blind spots without flinching. She did not soften her story. She sharpened it. Daniel tried to call twice. She did not answer. On the morning of the deposition, the federal building loomed gray and unadorned, its architecture indifferent to emotion. Margaret walked through security with steady steps, her coat folded neatly over her arm. Ellen walked beside her, silent but present. Victor Sloan sat at the far end of the conference room when they entered. He wore a tailored suit, posture relaxed, hands folded as if waiting for a meeting he expected to control. When his eyes met Margaret's, something flickered. Recognition, not fear. Calculation. He smiled. "Mrs. Hale." Margaret did not return it. The questioning began slowly. Names, dates, relationships. Victor answered smoothly at first, voice confident, dismissive when it suited him. He framed himself as an advisor, a guide, a man misunderstood by those who resented his success. Then Margaret spoke. She did not accuse. She described. She spoke of how Victor approached Daniel, not as a schemer, but as a confidant. How he framed resentment as insight. How he used language like dignity, legacy, fairness. How he positioned Margaret not as a partner, but as an obstacle. Victor shifted in his seat. Margaret continued. She spoke of the phone call, the photograph, the timing, the pressure applied at moments of vulnerability. She did not raise her voice. She did not waver. "This is speculation," Victor said sharply. "She's interpreting motives." Agent Ortiz leaned forward. "Mr. Sloan," he said evenly, "we'll determine what's speculative." Margaret turned toward Victor then, her gaze steady. "You didn't expect me to speak," she said. "You expected me to negotiate." Victor's smile returned, thinner now. "I expected you to protect yourself." "I am," Margaret replied, "just not the way you taught people to." By the end of the day, Victor's composure had cracked. Not dramatically, subtly. A pause too long. An answer reframed twice. A glance toward his attorney when none was needed. That evening, as Margaret left the building, a reporter called out her name. She stopped. Ellen's hand hovered near her arm. "Mrs. Hale," the reporter said, voice respectful but eager. "Do you believe this case represents a broader issue?" Margaret looked directly into the camera. "I believe it represents a silence that's been convenient for predators," she said, "and expensive for everyone else." The clip ran that night. By morning, Victor Sloan's advisory firm had removed his name from its website. 2 banks issued internal compliance alerts. A non-profit quietly suspended its partnership pending review. Victor called once. Margaret did not answer. She sat in her study that evening, the lamp casting a soft circle of light as snow fell steadily outside. She felt no triumph, only gravity. This was larger than her marriage, larger than her loss. She had stepped into a role she had never sought but now understood. Not a victim, a witness. And once witnessed, Victor Sloane's world could not return to shadow. It would have to face the light. The arrest did not come with sirens. Margaret learned that later when Agent Ortiz explained it in the careful, neutral language of procedure. At the time it happened, she was standing in her kitchen, rinsing a single cup in the sink, when Ellen's name appeared on her phone and stayed there, vibrating longer than usual. "They have him," Ellen said when Margaret answered. No preamble, no softening. Margaret closed the faucet. Water dripped once, then stopped. "Where?" "Outside Providence. He was on his way to a meeting he thought was routine. 2 agents, clean, quiet." Margaret leaned her hip against the counter. Her legs felt steady, which surprised her. She had expected something else. Relief, perhaps, or triumph. What she felt instead was a deep, settling stillness, like the moment after a long illness finally breaks. "And Daniel?" Margaret asked. Ellen hesitated. "He's cooperating." Margaret nodded, though Ellen could not see it. That made sense. Daniel had always wanted an authority to lean into once his own certainty collapsed. The house was silent after the call ended. Not the uneasy silence of before, but something closer to exhaustion. Margaret moves through the room slowly, touching nothing, simply letting the spaces register again. The chair by the window where Daniel used to read the paper. The bookshelf where she had quietly removed his framed photographs weeks ago without ceremony or anger. She stopped in the hallway where their wedding portrait once hung. The nail remained, a small mark in the wall. She considered removing it, then decided to leave it there. Evidence of what had been. That afternoon, a car pulled into the driveway. Margaret watched from the window as Emily stepped out, shoulders tense, hands tucked into her coat pockets. Margaret opened the door before she could knock. "I didn't know where else to go," Emily said. "You came to the right place," Margaret replied. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one that had become a war room, now cleared except for a bowl of fruit neither of them touched. Emily's eyes were red. She looked older than her 45 years. "They took him this morning," Emily said quietly. "He didn't fight. He just kept saying it was a misunderstanding." Margaret folded her hands. "It always is to the person who benefits." Emily swallowed. "I should have said something sooner. About Victor. About the way he talked." "You did say something," Margaret replied. "You just didn't know yet that it mattered." Emily nodded, tears spilling over at last. "I'm angry at him," she said, "and I'm angry at myself for still loving him." Margaret reached across the table, resting her hand over Emily's. "Both can be true," she said. "Love doesn't dissolve on command. Accountability doesn't require hatred." They sat like that for a long moment, grief shared but not fused, each woman carrying her own version of it. The next weeks unfolded in measured steps, court dates scheduled, statements filed, assets frozen. Victor Sloane's name appeared in places it never had before, legal briefs, regulatory notices, quiet conversations in rooms that once welcomed him warmly and now did not. Margaret testified again, this time before a grand jury. She spoke with the same calm clarity, her words precise, her memory exact. When she left the building, she felt lighter, not because the burden was gone, but because it was no longer hers alone. Daniel's plea agreement became public shortly after. Reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation. His photograph appeared briefly on a local news site. Margaret did not click the article. She did not need to see his face to understand the cost. One evening, as winter deepened, Margaret received a letter in the mail. Handwritten, no return address. She recognized Daniel's handwriting immediately. She read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it in the folder where she kept things that required no response. Forgiveness, she had learned, did not always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it meant release. The first invitation came from a local senior advocacy group. They asked her to speak, not about Victor or the case, but about financial autonomy later in life. Margaret hesitated. Visibility had a cost. She knew that now better than ever. She agreed anyway. The room was full. Faces lined with years, eyes alert, some wary, some hopeful. Margaret stood at the podium and did not dramatize her story. She told it plainly. Where trust had been misplaced, where silence had almost become surrender, where systems designed to protect could be twisted if no one asked the right questions. When she finished, a woman in the front row raised her hand. "How did you know?" she asked, voice trembling slightly. "When to stop being polite?" Margaret considered the question. "When politeness started costing me my agency," she said. The applause that followed was not loud. It was sustained. Afterward, people lingered, stories shared in hushed tones, confessions offered with relief. Margaret listened more than she spoke. That, too, was a form of power. That night, she returned home to a house that felt hers again. She poured a glass of water, turned off the lights one by one, and stood at the window. Snow fell softly, covering the ground without discrimination, erasing sharp edges, revealing nothing new and yet changing everything. Her phone buzzed once. A message from Ellen. "Indictment secured. Multiple counts. Federal." Margaret closed her eyes briefly, not in celebration, in acknowledgement. She had not sought to dismantle a man. She had refused to be dismantled herself. In the quiet that followed, Margaret understood something she had not before. Power did not announce itself in moments of dominance. It revealed itself in endurance, in the decision to stay present, to speak when silence would be easier, to accept the cost of clarity. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, Margaret Hale sat alone, not lonely, not victorious, but grounded in the truth of who she was now. Someone who had stepped forward when it mattered, and would not step back again. The sentence came at the end of winter, delivered without ceremony, without drama, the way consequences often arrive when there is nothing left to argue. Margaret was sitting in the back of the courtroom, hands folded in her lap, listening as the clerk read the verdict in a voice that never rose or fell. Victor Sloan was found guilty on all counts: wire fraud, conspiracy, elder financial exploitation, abuse of fiduciary process. The words stacked neatly, one after another, like bricks sealing a door. Victor did not look at her when the final word was spoken. He stared straight ahead, jaw set, eyes fixed on a point only he could see. For a moment, Margaret wondered if he was replaying every move he had made, searching for the turn where he could have chosen differently. She doubted it. Men like Victor did not believe in wrong turns, only in miscalculations. Daniel was not in the room. He had already faded into a different kind of quiet, one shaped by plea agreements and supervised movement, by the slow erosion of identity that came when excuses ran out. Margaret felt no satisfaction in that, only distance. Outside the courthouse, the press gathered in a loose semicircle, cameras angled, microphones extended. Margaret paused on the steps, the cold air sharp against her cheeks. Ellen stood beside her, steady as ever. "Mrs. Hale," a reporter called, "do you feel justice has been served?" Margaret considered the question. "I think accountability has begun," she said. "Justice is what comes after we learn from it." Another voice called out, "Do you see yourself as a symbol for older women?" Margaret shook her head gently. "I see myself as someone who refused to disappear." She did not stay longer than that. The car door closed, the cameras receded. Hartford slipped past the window in muted winter colors. In the weeks that followed, the consequences widened. Quietly at first, then all at once. Advisory firms cut ties. Non-profits issued statements. Banks revised protocols. A federal bulletin circulated with Victor Sloan's name attached to a description that stripped away the polish and left only the pattern. Margaret watched it unfold from a distance she had earned. She did not insert herself into the aftermath. She had learned when to step forward and when to step aside. This phase belonged to systems correcting themselves, imperfectly but visibly. One afternoon, Paul Henson called with an update. "We're seeing new reports," he said. "People coming forward now that they recognize the playbook." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "Good." "There's something else," Paul added. "They're asking if you'd be willing to consult, informally. Help agencies understand how these dynamics look from the inside. Margaret hesitated. She had not planned for that. I'm not an investigator. No, Paul said. You're something rarer. You're credible. She agreed to meet once, then twice. The conversations were careful, focused. She spoke about language, about timing, about how predators framed concern as care and control as protection. She watched as seasoned professionals took notes, not because she demanded attention, but because she spoke from lived precision. At home, life settled into a new rhythm. Margaret reorganized the study, not to erase Daniel, but to reclaim space. She donated his suits, archived shared documents, returned rooms to neutral ground. The house breathed differently now, lighter, honest. Emily visited often. Sometimes they spoke about Daniel, sometimes they did not. Grief did not require constant narration. It only required permission. One evening, Emily asked, "Do you ever wish you hadn't answered that call?" Margaret thought of the bank phone ringing in her kitchen, the way her hand had tightened around it. "No," she said. "I wish I had answered it sooner." Spring arrived slowly. Snow melted. Buds appeared on bare branches. Margaret began walking again in the mornings, the way she had years ago when thinking required motion. Neighbors waved. Some stopped to talk. A few mentioned the case gently, cautiously. Margaret answered when asked. She did not elaborate when she was not. The invitation to speak at a national conference came in late April, not as a keynote, as a panelist. The topic was elder autonomy and financial integrity. Margaret read the letter twice before setting it down. Ellen watched her from across the table. "You don't have to." "I know," Margaret said. "But you're considering it." Margaret nodded. "Because silence is comfortable, and comfort is expensive." The conference room was large, modern, filled with rows of attentive faces. Margaret sat between a former regulator and a clinical psychologist. She listened as they spoke about statistics, about trends, about risk factors. When it was her turn, she did not repeat what had already been said. She told a story instead. Not the headline version, the quiet one. The doubts, the moments of self-questioning, the temptation to resolve things privately, the cost of politeness, the danger of assuming longevity equaled safety. The room was still when she finished, not stunned, absorbing. Afterward, a man approached her, mid-60s, expensive coat, uncertain posture. "I didn't think this applied to me," he said, "until today." Margaret nodded. "That's how it starts." Back home, she found a letter waiting in her mailbox. This one typed, official. The Department of Justice thanked her for her cooperation. Enclosed was a notice that restitution proceedings were underway for identified victims. Margaret placed the letter on her desk and sat down. She felt no pride in it, only closure. That night she dreamed of water. Not rushing, not violent, just steady, reshaping stone over time. In early summer, Victor Sloan was sentenced. 18 years, no early release. The judge spoke plainly, without theatrics, about breach of trust, about harm that extended beyond money. Victor stood silent, smaller somehow, his confidence finally stripped of audience. Margaret did not attend. She spent that morning at the coast, sitting on a bench overlooking the water, the wind carrying salt and sound. She watched waves arrive and retreat, indifferent to individual stories, faithful only to motion. Her phone buzzed once. Ellen's name. "It's done," Ellen said. Margaret exhaled. "Thank you." "For what?" "For walking beside me," Margaret replied. "Not in front." She ended the call and remained where she was, letting the sun warm her face. She felt no triumph, no sense of victory. What she felt was alignment. The world had not changed because she wanted it to. It had changed because she refused to shrink. As she stood to leave, a woman sitting nearby caught her eye, older, thoughtful. "You spoke at the conference," the woman said. Margaret nodded. "Thank you," the woman added, "for not making it about fear." Margaret smiled. Fear is rarely the problem, she said. Distance is. She walked back to her car, the day unfolding ahead of her, unremarkable and precious in its ordinariness. The story was no longer unfolding toward her. It was moving outward now, carried by others, shaped by systems she had helped correct. Margaret Hale drove home along the coast, windows down, air rushing in, not looking back. There was nothing left behind that she needed to retrieve. Only a future that, for the first time in a long while, belonged entirely to her. The call came on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind of afternoon that once would have frightened her with its emptiness, but now felt earned. Margaret Hale was sitting in the sunroom, the windows open just enough to let in the sound of wind moving through the trees. She had a book open on her lap, not because she was reading closely, but because she liked the weight of it there. The house no longer felt like a monument to what had been lost. It felt functional, alive, honest. Her phone vibrated once against the table. Unknown number. She watched it ring, unmoving, then picked it up on the second vibration. "This is Margaret Hale." The woman on the other end sounded hesitant, her voice steadying as she spoke. "Mrs. Hale, my name is Susan Parker. I live in Oregon. I'm calling because I saw your talk online, the one from the conference." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "All right. My husband passed away 3 years ago," Susan continued. "Since then, his brother has been helping me manage some things. He says it's for my own good. After listening to you, I realized I don't feel protected. I feel small." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Not in sadness, in recognition. "You don't have to decide anything today," she said, "but you're right to listen to that feeling." There was a quiet exhale on the line. Relief, gratitude. "Thank you for answering," Susan said. Margaret ended the call and set the phone down. She remained where she was, listening to the leaves outside brush against one another, the sound gentle and persistent. It struck her then that this was how it continued, not with verdicts or headlines, but with conversations that traveled quietly from one life into another. Later that evening, Emily arrived with takeout and an expression that suggested she was still learning how to be comfortable in peace. They ate at the kitchen table, talking about ordinary things, work, neighbors, a stray cat that had started appearing on Emily's porch. At one point, Emily stopped and looked at Margaret. "Do you ever miss him?" she asked. Not accusing, curious. Margaret considered the question carefully. "I miss who I thought he was," she said. "I don't miss who he chose to become." Emily nodded. "That makes sense." After Emily left, Margaret cleaned the kitchen slowly, methodically, the way she now did everything. There was no urgency left in her movements, no need to outrun anything. She turned off the lights one by one and stood for a moment in the hallway, the house quiet around her. Upstairs in the study, she opened the old leather folder one last time. The documents inside no longer felt like armor. They felt archival, evidence of a chapter that had been closed with intention. She slid the folder into a filing box labeled simply "Past" and placed it on the shelf. The following week, Margaret traveled to Washington again, not as a witness, not as a symbol, but as an advisor. She sat at long tables with regulators, compliance officers, non-profit leaders. She listened. She spoke when necessary. She corrected language that softened harm into abstraction. She insisted on clarity. "Words matter," she said more than once. "They determine who is believed and who is dismissed." They listened. On her last night in the city, Margaret walked alone along the river. The lights reflected off the water in broken patterns, beautiful and imperfect. She thought of the younger version of herself who had believed that stepping back meant becoming irrelevant. She smiled at that memory, not with regret, but with understanding. Back home, spring deepened into summer. Margaret planted herbs in the garden and watched them grow. She began hosting small dinners again, not out of obligation, but because she wanted to. Friends returned with cautious warmth, unsure of how to speak about what had happened. Margaret made it easy for them. She spoke plainly. She did not perform resilience. She embodied it. One afternoon, Ellen stopped by unannounced, something she had not done in months. She carried a bottle of wine and a familiar look of appraisal. "You look different," she said. Margaret smiled. "So do you." They sat on the porch as the sun lowered, talking about nothing and everything. At one point, Ellen raised her glass. "To boundaries," she said. Margaret clinked her glass gently against it. "And to the courage it takes to enforce them." That night, Margaret stood again at the window, the same place she had stood when the phone first rang months earlier. The view was unchanged. Trees, sky, darkness settling softly. What had changed was her relationship to it. She was no longer bracing for intrusion. She was simply present. Her phone buzzed one final time before she went to bed. A message from Paul Henson. "Another report filed today. Someone came forward because of you." Margaret read it, then set the phone face down. She felt no urge to respond. This work no longer required constant acknowledgement. It was moving on its own now, carried by others who had found their voices. As she turned off the light, Margaret thought about the idea of legacy. Not money, not property, but permission. The quiet permission to speak, to question, to refuse to be managed into silence. She lay down and closed her eyes, the house settling around her. Tomorrow would be ordinary, and that, she had learned, was not something to fear. The story did not end with her winning. It ended with her choosing herself and leaving the door open for others to do the same. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below.